My name is Ryan Odo. I use he, him, his pronouns. I was a classroom teacher in secondary social studies for 10 years. I taught mostly high school, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, taught it all. I also taught a couple years of 6th grade. That was a real treat. And then I spent 3 years in a teacher leadership position at the kind of end of my K-12 teaching experience. My work has really revolved around trying to honor the experiences of young people in schools. One of the things in social studies that we talk about a lot is this idea that we're trying to prepare young people to be future citizens. And I drank that Kool-Aid when I started teaching. I was like, absolutely, I'm here to help preserve democracy. This is so important. And when I started to get to know these young folks and build really strong relationships with them, I started to realize that their political lives in school really mattered. And I started asking myself the question, why are we waiting to practice what it means to be an engaged citizen in ways that can make our communities better until they graduate? Why aren't we doing this right now? What might young people be able to do to solve the problems of schools that we as adults have not been successful in addressing because of whether it's their imaginations, whether it's their living school every single day? So there's no better perspective to take than a young person's on what needs to change. Whether we're talking about really, really big things like disciplinary procedures or policies, or we're talking about curriculum or teaching practices, or what feel like smaller things in the adult world of like lunch, or maybe passing time, how much time they have to get to classes, or how much time do they have to go outside, where the bathrooms are, is there accessibility? Those things still matter, even if in the scope of like an adult's perception, they are not necessarily as resonant as a policy might be. For the last, since 2017, I can't do the math that quickly, but I have been involved in youth participatory action research, or YPAR, and that led me to, a very natural extension of YPAR is youth organizing and activism. I know that that is something that can feel, from an outsider looking in, they're like, youth organizing and activism, that sounds really intense. And there are moments where it is, but the way that I interpret it is much more like young people have problems in their lives and they are really good at figuring out how to rally their peers and adults to support them in making their lives better. If a classroom teacher really wants to do kind of youth-driven work, young people need to trust that you are going to follow through on the things that you say you're going to do. Like, I can't walk into a classroom and be like, this is a youth-led space, when nobody in that room knows me as an adult because they read me as an adult and I'm an authority figure. So the first thing, and it took me probably probably 6 or 7 months, honestly, probably a good chunk of that first year, to really just be like, I recognize that I am an authority figure, and I also am going to actively work against that in ways that allow you to show up as people you want to be. So it'd be like small things, right? In the sense of like teaching, at least I think of they're small. Like kids are handing things in late and they're like, oh, I don't want to get docked points. I'm like, okay, you don't have to be docked points. That's fine. Like, this is our space. Hanging things, like all of the work on the walls, the aesthetic of the classroom was all student work. I didn't have any student work, to be clear, from the beginning of the class, but everything they did, whether it was like a project for class, whether it was like a doodle in class, they just found their way onto the walls. It was small and nevertheless like impactful, because they started to understand like, oh, like this is now reflecting a space that is ours. But again, that wasn't something that happened overnight. That took months and months and months of me showing up. It took times where class was literally falling apart. They could not care less about what I wanted to do that day. And me being like, I'm really frustrated, and coming back the next day and scrapping the lesson plan and being like, we just need to sit together. Like, how do we want to be together? And how can I show that I actually care about you in a way that is right for you? And taking the full time to make sure people are heard and that they were having a chance to say what they wanted to say, to disagree with each other, to disagree with me. It was probably in October when that finally started to take root, and one of the students in my class, I remember this really vividly, so we're probably doing something about, I don't know, geography. And he just rolled his eyes and he's like, Mr. Roto, I'm so tired of talking about this shit. And I was like, it's a geography class. What do you want to talk about? He's like, there are people in prison who are being like assaulted by guards, and we're sitting here talking about space and place. How do these things connect? And I was like, that's a really good point. Does anybody else want to talk about this thing instead? And so we listened to this student kind of like give a really eloquent monologue. I found a couple YouTube videos for the next day, and we just did essentially kind of like, what is the current state of prisons unit in that moment? When it came to kind of understanding the content and the standards and things like that, I viewed that as really like my responsibility. So everything that came to kind of like the Minnesota social studies standards was my responsibility to try to tie into what they were interested in talking about. And from that moment on, that trust just continued to strengthen and strengthen. So when the start of semester 2 happened, I knew I wanted to do a project like this. So I said to them, hey, like, do you all understand that I want to create a condition where this classroom can be yours? And so what I said to them was like, let's put it all on the table. What do you want to do? Like, what do you think would be an impactful project that would shape and transform this school for the better if something happened tomorrow? And we spent probably 2-3 days breaking that down. And then from that, we kind of like built a list, and I said, pick your top 3. Then from that list of top 3, then we narrowed it down to one idea that everybody could get on board. That consensus building was really important. One of the classes picked gun violence. And I was like, why is gun violence such a big deal to you? And they were talking about how gun violence is in their community and how they were worried about like the impact of school shootings would have kind of nationally, and they wanted to have a platform to talk about that issue in school. And so using the kind of framework that I had from YPAR and those resources, I said, all right, let's get to work trying to figure out what the information actually says. Because if we're going to go try to make a compelling argument to adults, then we need to have language that adults understand. And one of the sets of languages that adults understand is research. And they were like, well, why don't they just trust us? And that led us into this kind of conversation about power. That was really kind of the space where we started to deconstruct, okay, what is school? Who makes decisions in schools? What does it mean to exist as a young person in a school context? What happens when you hear people say things like, oh, we love youth voice, it's so important to us. And you'll see, young people sitting on school boards, but they have non-voting positions on school boards. What does that actually mean? And so we were really digging into those things before we were going into the project. And then as the project unfolded, because they would run into certain stumbling blocks, we would pause and have those kind of reflections on like positionality, power, agency, and how we use that strategically. So one example of that was as they were putting together kind of the resources, they wanted to do a professional development on gun violence, and they wanted to do a video. They weren't sure if they would be allowed to show this to their peers, and they weren't sure if they would be allowed to show it to teachers. And I said, all right, let's go to our power map. Essentially like a power map, if you take like an XY coordinate plane, and on the X-axis, on one side you have, for any issue, it says like strongly agrees with our position. And then on the opposite side, it says strongly disagrees with our position. And then on the Y-axis, you have at the very top, you say most institutional power. And at the very bottom, it says least institutional power. You start to map out various people. It creates a really common set of language for young people to talk about like, okay, who do we need to kind of convince to be on our side? So we went to our power map, and they noticed that a couple of the people they had put were the principal and the assistant principal. and as like people who agreed with the position that they were taking and people who had a lot of institutional power within the building. And I was like, do you think it would make sense to invite them in, talk about some of the things that you want to share, and then see what their perspective is as these institutional gatekeepers for how to navigate this process? And they're like, well, they're just, they're administrators. They're not going to believe us, da 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 da. And I was like, that's a fair concern to have. And if you let that concern stop you, then you're never going to actually know whether you're right or not. And so through those kind of like those back and forths that we would have, my job as an adult is not to simply be like, oh yeah, sounds good, guys. Like everything's cool. Like, oh, I guess that does make sense. Shoot, like I'm a part of this process too. The way I think about it is like, I'm not there for them. I'm there with them. And a 4 would be like, no, what you should do is, and tell them exactly what I think they should do. But being with them doesn't mean I have to just agree with everything they say. In fact, really strong adult facilitators of youth learning, I think, are really good at nudging. And that's a phrase that I take from Brian Lazinski, where like you can nudge people in the same way that you would nudge them in any sort of organizing conversation. Well, what happens if we think about it this way? Right? I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just asking the question. And if it's generative, fantastic. And then we go down that path together. Even if I disagree with you, we'll go down that path together. One of the easiest ways to build trust with young people is that you disagree with them and you still follow through with them. And there were a number of times that happened. So we invited the principal and the assistant principal in, and by we, I mean, they were like, oh, can you ask them? And I was like, no, like it's not my work, right? If you ask me to be an arbiter for your project, that actually doesn't make a lot of sense because then it looks like I'm doing the work. So you need to figure out how to do that. And we can practice. So we practiced, we rehearsed. It was cute in some ways because they were like really nervous, but they had such a good pitch that I knew it was just going to be super effective. And they went to the assistant principal's office during the class that they had with me the next day. They pitched her on coming to class, and she was in there the next week with the principal. And they listened to this pitch about the gun violence PD. They put on really serious administrative faces. It was cool to see. They were like, have you thought about this? Well, what are the community going to say? You thought about what happens if like we unintentionally trigger your peers who maybe have been around gun violence? Like, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about? But it was never like, this is not appropriate for you to be doing. And it was never like, this is wonderful, we're 100% supportive of this. It was like, we want to wrestle with this with you. And that was really cool because when it came time for them to kind of like make their decisions and revisit the power map, they had a lot more trust and confidence in these specific administrators. And those administrators confided in me, they were like, we haven't seen anything like this in a classroom. And this is really exciting. These kids are more energized in this class than we see them throughout the entire day. And I didn't think that was really about me. It was more just about the conditions and the fact that they were together trying to work on something to improve their community. I think that trust building where common teaching / schooling language is like, build relationships with students so that they can learn these standards. Build trust with young people so that you start to change. I wanted to build trust with young people as an educator because I wanted to have really meaningful and authentic experiences in my classroom. And where I started this initially thinking like, oh, I'm going to build this trust and then I'm going to be the one that's helping these kids do all these things, right? That kind of 4 mentality. What I came to realize was that in the process of building trust with young people, I was changing. And that was the bigger step and the harder reflection for me to make sense of. If you want to do youth-driven work, you have to honor their humanity. And that means sometimes swallowing those feelings of like anger and resentment or frustration or disappointment and saying like, how can I show up to show them that I can be a better person? Because if I can do that, then I actually will start to change and trust will be a very organic thing that comes with that. So I think trust is a really big part of that. I think one of the other steps is like, I think young people and frankly adults are very good at using generalizing language. Let's get precise. So precision became a really important step. We had to develop precision in the ways that we were both using language and thinking. And for me, then one of the steps was on the back end, letting certain decision makers know what was going on. This is a little bit of a trickier thing. You know, you want to be able to do things in the light of day, always. And I think my experience has taught me that sometimes doing things in the light of day can actually kill the project before it even gets off the ground. For me, one of the steps was working with administrators to help them see what was going on. So the example that I gave of the principal and the assistant principal coming into class, the follow-up with that, the principal called me into his office and I was like, oh God. And he's like, I'm so excited about this. This is awesome. I have so many ideas. They could do this, this, this. Let's have them do this. Let's have them do it. And I was like, whoa. Like, you got to pump the brakes, man. Like, this is not your place. And so it was actually taking a kind of a more of a pedagogical stance with administrators to say, if you want this work to continue, you need to give them space to try to figure things out. Even if you already know how it's going to go, we have to let them figure that out on their own. We can certainly ask questions, and back to that nudging point, we can nudge them in the direction we think might be better. But at the end of the day, if they decide to go a different way, we got to support them on that. We have those conversations probably at least once a week, which is a lot of time. I'm not going to lie about that. That's another, I think, important step. It's less student-centered and more adult-to-adult work. And I think one of the things I would also say to teachers who are interested in doing this work, you should really know who your administrators are. Not to diss on administrators, but they have their own set of like concerns and issues and politics that they have to constantly navigate too. So if you have strong administrators that are willing to back you, that makes a significant world of difference in trying to do this labor. Yeah, I think considerations that teachers need, I think for me, it was like I needed to know myself. And there was a lot I didn't know. But in terms of kind of like my professional status, I was coming in as an experienced educator. I wasn't in my first 3 years teaching and doing this work. Not to say that like pre-tenure teachers can't do this kind of youth-driven, youth-led work. It's just it's significantly riskier. And that obviously circles back to then know your administrators. I think knowing your own bandwidth, I think that's part of knowing yourself. If you're going to take this work on, I don't think that it's all consuming. There are moments of high stress for sure, because it's new, and new things, especially in teaching, can be really scary. But I think that it's easily the most rewarding thing I've ever done as an educator, just like full stop. I've never grown more as a person. I've never grown more as a teacher. I've never watched like young people grow as quickly. I always think about teaching as like planting seeds for someone else gets to like benefit from. And I think youth-driven work like this, especially in classroom contexts, you get to see a lot of growth really fast. I'll go back to the first thing I said, which is I came to this work thinking that I was, as a teacher, thinking that I was helping prepare future citizens. And I want people, both young and adults, to walk away from this realizing that change that being a citizen implies doesn't have to wait until you turn 18. It can happen today. You can go into your communities, whether it's a school community, whether it's an after-school community, whether it's a religiously affiliated organization, whether it's a sports team, like whatever community means to you, and you can start having that impact to create change in meaningful ways now. Like we don't have to wait for that. And like history has taught us that in so many different ways, that young people are the ones that are leading social change movements. So why is it that in schools, we try to convince ourselves as adults and subsequently young people that that's not the case? Why don't we just do it? And why do we label civic education as voting, lobbying, these very formal things, when there's actually so much more out there? If we break civic education down into like, what does it mean to be an effective citizen? And citizenship is about shared living, then really we're asking a question about what it means to be in community with one another. And young people told me very honestly, they said, we don't need to be told how to be in community, and we don't need to come to school to do that. And I was like, oh, so then what can we do in this space? How can we make sense of what you already know and amplify that in a way that allows for maybe not bigger change, because I don't think scale is an accurate measure of impact, but different change in spaces maybe where you feel more marginalized, not because it's fair for you to have to carry the torch of social transformation. I think the hope is for adults that we start to see that teaching is not simply about content delivery. I feel like social studies takes such a bad rap as like this weird trivial pursuit discipline, and I'm so over it. And I'm ready for social studies educators to become those people who are like, yeah, what do we want to change in our community? Not necessarily because I agree with everything that these young people that I work with are saying, but because change is a really meaningful thing. And to take from, I think, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century and 21st century, Octavia Butler, change is the only constant. And so we can either let that happen to us, or we can prepare for it and understand that we can also shape that change.